The recording had no sound. That was the first thing Cadet Vasethrin noticed when the instructor loaded the file. Every combat document in the Interstellar Defense Academy's archive carried an audio signature, weapons discharge, comm traffic, the physiological readings of combatants broadcast in real time. This one had nothing. Just light and movement and a timestamp that the Academy's own verification system had flagged 3 separate times as impossible. The instructor didn't explain the silence. She set the file running and stepped away from the display as if she didn't want to be too close to it. On screen, a human moved through smoke. Vasethrin leaned forward. Around him, 47 cadets from 11 different species did the same, a reflex so universal that he noticed it without being able to stop it. Something about the way the human moved produced that response. Something that the Academy's xenopsychology lectures had never quite prepared him for. The timestamp in the corner read, *GSC year 2847. Day 214. Hour 19:33, *. That timestamp was the third flag. It was 11 months before humanity made first contact. The human on screen was wearing equipment that shouldn't have existed. Not because it was advanced, it wasn't. Vasethrin had studied enough human military history to recognize the general design lineage. It was old, outdated by human standards even at the time of recording. What shouldn't have existed was the human inside it. The suit had been breached in 4 places. Vasethrin could see the breach seals, bright orange emergency patches the size of his palm, applied from the inside, which meant the human had stopped mid-engagement to apply them, which meant the human had known the suit was failing, which meant the human had continued anyway. "That is not what I want you to focus on," the instructor said. Her name was Subcommander Ilith Daravus. No relation to Cadet Vasethrin despite the shared syllable, a coincidence she had acknowledged exactly once on the first day and never again. She was Kalehari, tall, silver-jointed, with the particular stillness of a species that had evolved in low-gravity caves and learned to conserve every movement. She did not pace. She did not gesture. When she spoke, the room heard it. "Focus on the terrain," she said. Vasethrin looked at the terrain. He immediately wished he hadn't. The engagement was taking place inside what the file's metadata labeled a Kethvern strategic installation, a weapons coordination hub that, at the time of recording, had been considered functionally impregnable. The Kethvern were not a species the Academy discussed in polite context. They had been a Tier 2 expansionist civilization with a 700-year military tradition and a particular philosophy about smaller species that had motivated 4 separate galactic intervention attempts before their eventual dissolution. Their installations were built for extended siege. Redundant power, redundant life support, self-sealing corridors, automated defense grids that could operate for 40 years without external signal. The human was inside one of those corridors. Alone. The automation was active. "Pause," said Subcommander Daravus. The image froze. The human was mid-stride, one arm extended, the other pulled close to the torso, and there was something in the extended hand that Vasethrin couldn't immediately classify. It looked improvised. It looked like it had been built from components belonging to at least 3 different systems, none of which were originally designed to interface. "What is that device?" Daravus asked the room. Silence. "Anyone?" A cadet near the back, Harith, a Selenic with 4 years of engineering background, said carefully, "It looks like a power coupling from a Keth emergency bypass panel. Fused to something I don't recognize." "You don't recognize it because it didn't exist before this recording," said Daravus. "The human built it inside the installation, using components stripped from the installation's own systems, while the automated defense grid was active. She let that sit for exactly 4 seconds. Vasethrin counted. The grid fired on the human 31 times during the construction process, she added, and then she pressed play again. The recording lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds in total. By the end of it, Vasethrin was aware that his hands were pressed flat against the desk in front of him, and that he could not remember placing them there. He was also aware that 3 cadets in his immediate vicinity had stopped breathing in any rhythm he could identify, not from fear exactly, but from something that didn't have a clean word in standard Kalahari or the 4 other languages he spoke functionally. When the recording ended, the display went dark. Not to the Academy interface. Not to the standard post-document menu. Just dark. Like whatever had been on the screen had used up the light. Questions? Said Daravos. Harith spoke first. The human survived. That is not a question. I know, said Harith. I'm saying it because I need to say it out loud before I can form the question. The human survived. Yes. How? That, said Daravos, is precisely what this semester's coursework will attempt to answer. You will not succeed. That is also intentional. She moved to the front of the room, not quickly, never quickly, but with the particular economy of motion that made her seem to cover distance without quite moving through it. I want to tell you 3 things about this recording before we proceed. First, it is real. It has been authenticated by 6 independent verification bodies, none of whom communicated with each other during the process, and all of whom reached the same conclusion. Second, the timestamp is accurate. This engagement occurred before humanity joined the Galactic Sphere Compact. Before first contact. Before we knew they existed. She paused. Before they knew we existed. Vasethrin felt the hairs along his forearms, vestigial, useless, somehow always alert, rise in unison. And third, said Daravos, we don't know who recorded it. The question of the recording's origin consumed the next 2 weeks of Vasethrin's mental bandwidth in ways that disrupted his sleep cycle and caused his physiological monitoring implant to flag 3 minor stress anomalies, all of which he cleared with a false report because he didn't want to explain what was actually wrong. What was wrong was this. The more he researched the recording, the less sense it made, and the less sense it made, the more he was certain that he was missing something fundamental, not about the recording but about humans. About what they were. About what the Galactic Sphere Compact had actually incorporated when humanity joined 11 months after that timestamp. He was in the archive bay at hour 14 of his personal investigation when Harith sat down across from him without asking. You're doing the thing, Harith said. What thing? The thing where you don't eat and you pull every secondary source and you build a physical diagram of connections even though the Academy's systems can model this digitally. Harith looked at the actual paper diagram Vasethrin had constructed across 3 desk surfaces. I do the same thing. It means you've found something that doesn't fit. Everything doesn't fit, said Vasethrin. Pick the one that bothers you most. Vasethrin looked at the diagram. The installation's internal network logged the human's presence for 9 minutes and 40 seconds, which matches the recording. But the Kethvaran damage reports filed after the installation was ultimately abandoned, not because of this incident, 2 years later, for unrelated reasons. Those damage reports reference a long-duration incursion event. He found the relevant section on the diagram and pressed his finger to it. Not 9 minutes and 40 seconds. They used the phrase long duration. In Kethvaran military documentation, that phrase has a specific legal definition. It means a minimum of 6 standard hours. Harith was quiet for a moment. So either their damage reports were wrong. Their damage reports were never wrong. They had a formal military culture built around documentation precision. Or, said Harith slowly, the 9 minutes and 40 seconds we watched wasn't the whole event. Vasethrin nodded. Something happened before the recording starts. Or after it ends. Or both. He looked at the diagram. And someone cut it. Someone chose what we would see. Or, Harith said, and his voice had changed into something quieter, someone chose what we could handle. Subcommander Daravos's office had no windows. Vasethrin had always assumed this was an aesthetic preference. Kalahari often preferred enclosed spaces, an evolutionary holdover from the cave systems. But standing in it now, presenting his findings, he revised that assumption. The lack of windows felt deliberate. The lack of anything to look at except her face felt deliberate. You found the discrepancy in the damage reports, she said, when he finished. Yes, Subcommander. How long did it take you? 14 hours. The previous class took 3 weeks. She didn't say this like a compliment. She said it like information. Before that, one cadet figured it out in 6 days. Before that, no one found it at all. She folded her hands on the desk. Every year I show that recording to new cadets. Every year, I tell them the 3 things I told you. And then I watch them. Watch them do what? Watch them decide what the recording means. She stood. Most cadets decide the human was exceptional, an outlier. They mentally classify what they saw as the upper boundary of human capability, a once-in-a-generation event that can be academically noted and then compartmentalized. She moved to the side of the office, where a secondary display panel sat dark. They are comfortable with that interpretation. It lets them remain comfortable with what humanity is. But that's wrong, said Vasethrin. Tell me why. Because if it were true, the recording would have been used as inspiration, as a profile of human excellence. He heard his own voice finding certainty as he spoke. Instead, it's used as a warning. You didn't show us this to make us admire humans. You showed us this to make sure we never underestimate them. He paused. And you specifically told us 3 things that ensured we'd never feel fully settled. The silence, the timestamp, the unknown source. You built in the discomfort deliberately. Daravas looked at him for a long moment. The recording, she said, is not a warning about exceptional humans. She activated the secondary display. It showed a database entry, a personnel file. The name at the top was human, and beside it was a photograph, and below the photograph were 2 dates, a birth year and a service record commencement, and then at the bottom, where a final date should have appeared, there was nothing. No end date. Because the human in the file was the human in the recording. And according to every record the Galactic Sphere Compact maintained, that human was still alive. Still active. Still listed as a serving member of a joint human GSC operational unit. Vasethrin stared at the photograph. That recording is 63 years old, he said. Yes. He did the math. He didn't want to, but he did it anyway. That would make them 81 standard years by human biological reckoning, said Daravas. Which is significant. But it is not the reason I'm showing you the file. She pointed to a field near the middle of the entry. A classification marker. A single line of text that Vasethrin had to read twice because the first time he was certain he'd misread it. Asterisk event file. GSC/2847/D214. Status, incomplete. Follow-on events, classified Tier 1. Cross-reference, 847 subsequent documented engagements. Human, same individual, asterisk. 847. Subcommander, said Vasethrin, and his voice came out very quiet. What was the full duration of the Kethvaran installation incursion? Daravas turned off the display. 11 days, she said. What followed in Vasethrin's understanding of the situation was not a clean expansion of knowledge. It was more like a structure he'd been standing inside suddenly revealing that it had no floor, that he had been floating all along and hadn't noticed because the walls looked so solid. 11 days. One human. Inside an automated Kethvaran military installation with redundant defense grids and self-sealing corridors. 11 days. He pulled every accessible record he could find on the Kethvaran installation incident. Most of it was classified above his clearance, which itself told him something. You didn't classify logistics or standard operations. You classified things that changed the way other species thought. He found the edges of it in cross-referenced damage assessments, in Kethvaran internal communications that had been captured and translated during their dissolution proceedings, in the single sentence of a post-conflict analysis written by a Kalahari strategic observer who had apparently visited the installation after it was abandoned. The sentence read, asterisk, this installation was not defeated from the outside. It was convinced, from within, that it had already lost. Vasethrin read that sentence 11 times. He was still reading it when Harith appeared again. I found the audio, said Harith. Vasethrin looked up. There is no audio, Daravas said. I said it had no audio signature in the archive system, said a voice from the doorway, and Subcommander Daravas stepped in. She didn't look surprised to find Harith there. She looked like she had been waiting for exactly this moment. I did not say there was no audio, I said what I said precisely. She was holding a data module. The audio exists, she said. It is kept separate from the visual recording because they cannot be shown together without violating a human GSC joint agreement on psychological impact protocols. She set the module on the desk but didn't activate it. The visual alone causes measurable stress responses in most non-human species. The two together caused a full cessation event in a Varadi delegate during a classified briefing in 2891. Complete neurological shutdown from overwhelming threat response activation. He recovered. Partially. And you're going to play us the audio, said Vasethrin. I'm going to play you 11 seconds of it, said Daravas. The 11 seconds the Academy's Psychological Review Board determined could be presented without triggering cascading responses in healthy subjects under supervised conditions. She activated the module. The audio that came out of it was a human voice. It was not screaming. It was not commanding. It was not the particular tonality that Vasethrin had studied in xenolinguistics courses, the formal cadence of human military communication, clipped and precise and information-dense. The human was talking to the installation, not to a comm unit, not to a partner on the other end of a channel, talking to the building, to the automated system that was firing on them. In a low, conversational voice, the way Vasethrin's instructors sometimes spoke to difficult cadets, patient, almost gentle, with an undercurrent of absolute certainty that the speaker had time, had already won, was simply waiting for the other party to understand the situation. The specific words were in a human dialect Vasethrin didn't speak. The translation appeared on Daravas's secondary display in real time. Asterisk, you've got 11 more of those in this corridor before your secondary array needs to cycle. I got time. You want to talk about your power routing options? Or should we just wait? The audio cut. No one in the room said anything for a long time. They were injured, said Harith finally. For breach seals. 31 direct hits from the defense grid. And they were. Negotiating, said Vasethrin. Not negotiating, said Daravas. Narrating. The human was telling the installation what was going to happen. Not asking. Not demanding. Telling. As a statement of observed fact. She picked up the data module and put it away. The installation's automated decision tree logged the exchange. We have those records. The system had no protocol for a combatant who was neither retreating nor attacking during a weapon cycle delay. Every system it had was built on the assumption that targets behaved according to survival optimization. Move away from fire, or move toward objective, or die. And the human did none of those things, said Vasethrin. The human sat down, said Daravas. The logs show 0 movement for 3 minutes and 42 seconds while the secondary array cycled. Then the human stood up and continued. The following 3 weeks were the most educationally violent experience of Vasethrin's academic life, and he had spent 6 months in a xenobiological field posting on a moon with atmospheric pressure that required constant medication to survive. Daravas walked them through the 847 subsequent documented engagements one by one. Not all of them. The full files would have taken years, and most were still classified, but enough. Enough to build a shape. Enough to understand what the shape meant. The human's name was Sergeant-Designate Elara Voss. Another coincidence that Vasethrin found disturbing in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The shared syllable felt like a trick the universe was playing on him, making the abstract personal. Elara Voss had enlisted in the human military at the age of 17. The recording at the Kethvern installation had occurred when she was 18. The Academy's timeline showed what followed, a series of engagements that, when plotted chronologically, described not a military career but something more like a study. A methodical, escalating, deeply personal investigation into what breaking points looked like and what existed on the other side of them. Every engagement was harder than the last. Not by accident. The records made clear she had requested increasingly difficult assignments. Had, in several cases, specifically asked to be sent into situations that other operatives had deemed unsurvivable. Why? Said Vasethrin during one of the sessions. It wasn't a complete question, but Daravas understood it. We asked her, said Daravas. 43 years into her career, during a formal psychological evaluation required for her continued GSC joint designation status, a Kalahari evaluator asked her directly why she consistently chose harder assignments after demonstrating she could survive easier ones. What did she say? Daravas's expression did something Vasethrin had never seen a Kalahari face do. It wasn't quite discomfort. It was closer to the look of someone who had opened a door expecting a room and found instead an unlit distance that went farther than they could see. She said she wasn't choosing hard assignments, said Daravas. I'm not choosing the hard ones. I'm choosing the ones where someone needs to go, and I'm the one who can go. Then she paused and she said, Daravas stopped. Restarted. She said, I keep thinking one of them will finally be enough. That the situation will finally be bigger than me and I can stop and rest. So far they haven't been. But I'm patient. The room was silent. She meant that, said Harith slowly, as something positive. The evaluator wasn't certain, said Daravas. The transcript notes that the evaluator sat with the response for several seconds before asking a follow-up question, because they needed time to determine whether what Alaravas had just said was an expression of hope, or a description of something else entirely. What was the follow-up question? Do you want to stop? Said Daravas. And? She said yes. Daravas's voice was completely level. She said yes, she wanted to stop, she would like very much to stop, she was tired in ways she didn't have good words for, and she had been tired in those ways for a long time. The pause. And then she said that wanting to stop and stopping were different things, and that she knew the difference, and that she thought it was important that someone did. The semester was 8 weeks long. By the 5th week, Vasethrin had stopped sleeping in anything approaching a normal pattern, not because of stress exactly but because his mind kept returning to the same point of friction no matter what else he directed it toward. 847 engagements. 6 of those engagements, he'd found this in an unclassified summary report that cited the number without elaboration, had resulted in Alaravas being listed as killed in action by the reporting authority, only to have that classification reversed when she returned. 6 times. 6 times the official record had said she was dead. He was still sitting with this when Harith found him in the archive bay again, and Harith had a look on his face that Vasethrin had learned to associate with findings that felt like falling. I found something in the Kethvern dissolution records, said Harith. The ones that were partially declassified last decade for historical research purposes. What kind of something? The kind that changes the question we've been asking. Harith sat down. We've been asking why she kept taking harder assignments. Why she kept going back. What she was doing. He pulled up a translated document on the desk display. I think we had it backwards. We were looking at it from our side, from the GSC's side, from the military side. We were asking what she was doing to the enemy. And? Harith pointed to a section of the translated text. It was a Kethvern internal strategic analysis, written during the final year before their dissolution. The specific section was a threat assessment compiled by their intelligence corps, listing the factors they identified as contributing to their operational failures in contested zones. Item 7 read, Persistence entity, single human combatant, unconfirmed designation, operating across 12 separate engagement theaters with no observed resupply or rotation. This entity is not believed to be an isolated operative. Working hypothesis. This entity is a psychological operation, a constructed narrative intended to demoralize. No biological entity could sustain the recorded operational tempo across this timeline. Recommend, treat all reports of this entity as enemy disinformation. They thought she was a myth, said Vasethrin. They convinced themselves she was a myth, said Harith. Because the alternative, he stopped. The alternative was that she was real, said Vasethrin, and if she was real, they had no answer for her. They went into their final strategic withdrawal believing they had correctly identified a human deception operation, said Harith. They thought they were being smart. They thought they had figured it out. He closed the document. They dissolved believing she didn't exist, he said. She attended the dissolution proceedings as a GSC observer. She was in the room when the Kethvern High Command formally surrendered, The image that produced in Vasethrin's mind arrived without invitation and would not leave. A human woman, tired in ways she didn't have good words for, sitting in a formal chamber surrounded by the leadership of a civilization that had spent years insisting she was a fiction, watching them put their names to the document that ended their empire. Did she say anything? He asked. At the proceedings. Is there a record? There's a transcript, said Harith. The Kethvaran commander asked her, apparently directly, breaking protocol, just turned and asked her. He said, "What were you trying to prove?" What did she say? She said, "Nothing. I was just trying to make sure someone was there." The 8th week of the semester brought the final lecture, and Daravas did something she had not done in any previous session. She asked the cadets to write down, before she spoke, what they thought the recording had been trying to teach them. Vasethrin wrote, *, that humans are capable of more than their biology should allow. He looked at it, crossed it out, wrote, *, that humans do not stop when it becomes rational to stop. Looked at it, crossed it out, wrote nothing for 3 minutes. Then he wrote, *, that the most dangerous thing about humans is not what they can do. It's what they can mean. To themselves and to each other. They fight for reasons that survive past the point where the reasons make sense. He didn't cross that out. When Daravas collected the submissions and read through them, she stopped at his. She read it twice. Then she set it aside separately from the others. "One of you," she said to the room, "wrote something I'm going to keep." She didn't say who. Most of you concluded, correctly, that the lesson is about endurance, about pain tolerance, about biological and psychological persistence beyond expected parameters. She folded her hands. All of that is true. All of that is also incomplete. She moved to the front display and activated something Vasethrin hadn't seen before. Not the recording. Not a file. A live feed. Low resolution, long distance, from what appeared to be a surveillance position somewhere cold and dark and high altitude. In the center of the frame, on a terrain that Vasethrin didn't immediately recognize, a single figure was moving. Moving slowly, deliberately, in a direction that the overlaid tactical data marked as a deactivated forward position, somewhere no one was supposed to be going. The figure was human. The physiological overlay that populated across the feed as the Academy's systems parsed the biometrics read like a catalog of the damage a body could sustain and continue to operate inside of. Joint inflammation cascading through 4 major structures. Pulmonary scarring consistent with repeated pressure event exposure. Neurological flagging in 3 regions associated with long-term high-stress operation. And a heartbeat. Steady. Unhurried. Moving at exactly the pace the terrain required and no faster, with the patience of something that had a very long time ago stopped measuring its progress in units that could be frustrated. "She is 73 days from mandatory retirement," said Daravas. "This is a live monitoring feed from her current assignment. She filed for this assignment herself. The position is a decommissioned monitoring station in a contested sector that every other analysis concluded was no longer strategically relevant." She paused. 3 days ago, it became relevant again. There is currently 1 individual between a civilian evacuation convoy and a live threat. The figure on screen moved through shadow. "She knows," said Daravas. "She was briefed. She was offered extraction. She declined." She looked at the cadets. "The question I want you to carry with you, not for this class, not for an assignment, but for your careers, is not, how does she do this? You've spent 8 weeks with that question and you will not finish answering it in your lifetimes." She pointed at the screen. "The question is, what does it mean for every other species in this galaxy that she is out there right now? That there are others like her? Not many. Humans are not a species of Ilara Vasas. Most of them are not this. But enough of them are enough of this that the shape of galactic conflict has been altered. The math of what is survivable has been changed." She turned off the feed. The room felt smaller without it. The darkness where the screen had been felt occupied. "Humans are not the strongest species in this compact," said Daravas. They are not the most technologically sophisticated, the most biologically durable, or the most strategically sophisticated by formal metrics. She looked around the room, and Vasethrin had the particular sensation of being looked at not as a student but as something that had just been handed a responsibility it didn't fully understand yet. They are the species that continues, long past the point where any rational assessment of the situation would recommend stopping, long past the point where continuation is logical or optimal or safe. The pause. Long past the point where the species doing the continuing is certain it will survive. She picked up Vasethrin's submission from the separate pile. She didn't read it aloud. She looked at it once more, then set it down. The Kethvern thought Elara Voss was a story, she said. A constructed myth. A deception. They were wrong. But I want you to consider, really consider, how it felt when you first watched that recording, when you first heard those 11 seconds of audio, when you first understood the gap between what the installation's logs recorded and what the damage reports described. Consider what it felt like to realize the recording had been edited. To realize the full event was longer, harder, stranger than what we showed you. Her voice was very quiet now. You felt that, didn't you? That thing with no clean name. Not fear exactly. Not awe exactly. Vasethrin felt it again, as if she'd reached across the room and reactivated something. That, said Daravos, is the appropriate response to humans. Not admiration. Not terror. That specific feeling, the one that tells your threat assessment systems there is something here you do not fully understand, something that does not behave according to the models you were given, something that makes you want to keep watching because you are not sure what it will do next and you are somehow more afraid of looking away than of continuing to look. She picked up her materials. She moved toward the door. Dismissed, she said, and then she stopped. Turned back just for a moment. One more thing. The monitoring feed. She looked at the display that now held only darkness. The convoy it's protecting. 14,000 civilians. 22 species represented. The threat that emerged 3 days ago is significant, I won't detail it, but it exceeds what any formal analysis would consider a one-person viable engagement. She met Vasethrin's eyes. She knows that too, said Daravos. She was fully briefed. She has all the same information you would have. She did the same math you would do. And she still went, said Vasethrin. She was already there, said Daravos. She went before we asked. Before we briefed her. Before the threat was fully confirmed. The subcommander's voice carried something in it now that Vasethrin had never heard from her. Not warmth exactly, but a cousin of it that lived closer to grief. She had looked at the sector maps 3 weeks ago and concluded that this moment was coming. That someone would need to be there when it arrived. And that she was the one who could go. She left. The cadets sat in the room for a while without speaking, which was unusual enough that Vasethrin noticed it the way you notice a silence that has weight. What he was thinking about, what he suspected most of them were thinking about, was not the tactical situation, not the 14,000 civilians, not the formal military analysis of odds or outcomes. He was thinking about an 81-year-old human, tired in ways she didn't have good words for, who had looked at an incoming situation and calculated not whether she could survive it but whether someone needed to be there, and then walked toward it, alone, in the dark, the same way she had walked through a Kethvern corridor 63 years ago, sitting down patiently while a weapons array cycled, talking to the building that was trying to kill her as if the outcome were already settled and they were just working through the formalities. He thought about the Kethvern commander in that formal chamber, looking at a woman his civilization had spent years insisting was a myth, and asking her what she had been trying to prove. And her answer, nothing. I was just trying to make sure someone was there, Not glory. Not legacy. Not the particular human drive towards significance that the xenopsychology textbooks loved to invoke. Something simpler and more frightening than any of those things. The plain, quiet, almost bureaucratic sense of responsibility that said this situation requires a presence. I am a presence, therefore. The galaxy had built its models around strength and technology and evolutionary advantage and formal military doctrine, And all of those models were correct, and all of those models together still did not capture the specific shape of what Alaravos was, because she was not a military asset or a strategic variable or a threat tier to be categorized. She was someone who had decided very early and very quietly that she would go to the places that needed someone to go, and that she would keep going until the places ran out or she did. And the places had not run out. Vasethrin looked at the darkened display for a long time. Somewhere on a frozen ridge in a contested sector, a monitoring feed was recording a steady biometric signature, damaged and tired and patient and absolutely, incomprehensibly, still moving. He wondered if she thought about being watched. If she knew Cadet studied her. If she understood that her career had been extracted from the classified archives and used for 11 years to break the comfortable assumptions of young officers who thought they had mapped the upper limit of what a living thing could endure. He suspected she didn't think about it. He suspected she was too busy doing the thing to think much about the watching. He suspected that was part of it. That the watching and the naming and the careful academic study of what she was all existed in a different register entirely from the register she operated in. That all the documentation and the testimony and the translated enemy assessments and the 11 seconds of preserved audio were ways of trying to hold still a thing that would not hold still. Portraits of motion. Maps of a country that kept changing its own borders. He turned off the display, put on his coat, walked out of the archive bay into a corridor that smelled like recycled air and institution, the same corridor he walked every day, unremarkable. He stopped. There was a window at the end of the corridor, a real one, not a display, one of the Academy's few genuine transparency panels looking out at the orbital dock infrastructure and beyond that the gradients of space, and beyond that, nothing visible but everything implied. He stood at it for a while. Somewhere out there, in a specific set of coordinates that a live monitoring feed was actively tracking, a heartbeat was moving through cold and dark toward something that most rational analyses said was too large for one person. The heartbeat was not hurrying. The heartbeat was not afraid, or if it was afraid, and Vasethrin found himself hoping, with a ferocity that surprised him, that it had long since learned that afraid and going were not opposites. He put his hand on the transparency panel. It was cold. The cold came through the glass the way meaning came through the recording. Partially, imperfectly, enough to know the original thing was much colder than what you were receiving. He left his hand there for one more moment. Then he went to his quarters and set an alarm for the mandatory physiological rest period and lay down, and in the space between waking and sleep thought about all the places in the galaxy that needed someone to be there, and about what it meant that somewhere out in that vast dark, the person who had decided to go was still going. Still going. Still going. The alarm would wake him in 6 hours. Somewhere else, something much older and much